All right, kidsmen out that way. Down the hall into the hut. The rest of us will stay here and we'll turn to the book of Judges. 3 more weeks in the book after today. Today we'll be looking at chapters 14 and 15. And then we'll look at 16 next week, 17 and 18 the following, and then 19 till the end of the chapter takes us to, I think, February 1st. And so after that, little break, and then into the Gospel of John for, as we have said, the Lord only knows how long. My original outline was somewhere in the 42 range, is expanded to reach just over 50. And who knows where it'll end up being by the time we're done. So we're not going to read both of these chapters, but I do want to read chapter 14. Again, Scripture tells us that we are blessed when we publicly read the Scriptures. You are blessed for listening. I'm blessed for reading. And so why don't we get a blessing by reading chapter 14. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and he told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all your people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. After some days he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. He scraped it out into his hands and went on, eating as he went. And he came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said to them, Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And they said to him, Put your riddle that we may hear it. And he said to them, Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. And in 3 days they could not solve the riddle. On the 4th day they said to Samson's wife, Entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? And Samson's wife wept over him and said, You only hate me. You do not love me. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is. And he said to her, Behold, I have not told my father nor my mother, and shall I tell you? She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted. And on the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him hard. Then she told the riddle to her people. And the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. We'll leave it there. We'll summarize 15 when we get that far. Let's commit our time to the Lord. Heavenly Father, we ask once again that you be with us this morning as we turn our attention to your word. We recognize this familiar guy in Samson. For those of us who have been in the church, we've seen many pictures of him and heard many stories about him. And Lord, as we come to reading the text about his life and his character, I pray that you would help us to only hear those things that are true, only those things which are embedded within your purposes for Israel as revealed in this text. And so we ask for your Holy Spirit to guide our time here, to mold us and shape us using the Word of God, and that you would make us your people that are obedient to you for your glory and for the furtherance of your kingdom. Amen. Once again, we find ourselves in the life of Samson. He's the last judge that the book of Judges is going to look at. And as we've seen throughout the book of Judges, as the kind of latter days of the judges come to a conclusion, we also realize that accompanying the end of the time of the judges is the thorough, what I've referred to as the Canaanization of the people of Israel. They are looking more and more and more like their surroundings, like the Canaanite peoples around them, than they should, because they've been set apart by God as the nation of Israel. And here we find ourselves in the story of Samson in the southern part of Israel. We're in a tribe directly north of the Philistines, and where they occupy their territory, modern-day Gaza, roughly. And up until this point, they've endured 40 years of oppression. We don't know exactly what that looked like. We don't know exactly how the Philistines enacted that. But what we do know is that the Philistines were oppressing Israel from their home base in their homeland. And we read nothing about Israel caring at all. In previous Judges, we read that they're oppressed for X number of years, and then they realize, oh, wait a minute, we have an all-powerful God, and then they cry out and say, Lord, will you fix this for us? Will you just remove these oppressors? But here, there's no mention of that fact at all. Israel seems to be settled within their oppression. Probably, I think by implication, is that they're settled within their Canaanization. They don't have any problems with the Philistines being around and the Philistines influencing them to the level that they are. They're comfortable in their situation. They're comfortable being persecuted by what are, throughout the Old Testament, and even, as we mentioned, till today, their greatest of enemies. They've been fighting since the Old Testament, and they continue to fight now. But we read in chapter 13 that God is not comfortable with this situation. He's not happy that his people are being oppressed, that they're being controlled, that they're being Canaanized by the nations around them. And it's because he feels mercy for them, but it's also because he has a long-term plan for his people. He's got a purpose for them. He's leading them somewhere. And so he refuses to allow Israel to be fully assimilated into the pagan Philistine ideologies. And so the people of Israel are comfortable, but God is not. Even though they do not cry out, God recognizes that what's going on in Israel is not what he wants for his people. And so we read this nativity story in chapter 13, where God sends an angel of the Lord to an unnamed woman who was barren from the tribe of Dan, meets with her and says, you're going to have a son. You're going to bear a son. Even though you've been barren to this point, you're going to have a son. He's going to be the deliverer of Israel. He's going to live as a Nazarite, which means he's not going to drink any wine. He's not going to even have anything of a grape. No grapes, no seeds, no skin, no wine, no juice, no nothing. He's not going to cut his hair, and he's not going to be able to come in contact with a dead human body. And so God is saying to this woman and to her husband Manoah that he is going to give her a child for the express purpose of disrupting the cozy relationship that Israel has with the Philistines and, by extension, as we've seen in the past, other Canaanite influences within Israel. And so we jump from 13 when he's born and when he's starting to stir in verse 20 of chapter 13, 25 of chapter 13. We jump all the way into chapter 14, just directly into the middle of his life. We don't know how old he is. We know that he's old enough to marry. We don't know anything about what has happened between his birth and this point. But we're thrust immediately into a bit of a crazy story as Samson is engaging himself with this unnamed woman from the town of Timnah, a town which would have been, 5 or 6 kilometers maybe south of the border of the tribe of Dan and Philistia. So we're not talking a long ways away. Now, if you've read the story of Samson, you'll know that he's a complicated individual. He is truly an enigma because he's a man who was sent by God to save his people. He was called by God before he was born to live according to a certain standard, a certain vow which was thrust upon him. And in these chapters, we read at several significant points, the author is very clear that the Spirit of God descends on him in order to do some very, very key things. And so he's a guy that is clearly a judge of Israel, a deliverer of God's people. He is clearly sent to stand up for God's purposes and to rise up against the Philistines, against the Canaanites. And yet, he is also one who is going to struggle mightily with, I think we could say it this way. I don't like to psychologically analyze biblical characters, but I think it's relatively safe to say that Samson was a bit of a narcissist. He's a bit self-centered. He had a very, very quick temper. And the thing that we probably know the most about him, dude had some serious lusts of the flesh that he was battling with. And so we've got this enigma of an individual sent by God, called by God, set apart by God, given the Spirit of God, and yet the dude was just this narcissistic, quick-tempered, lustful individual that got himself into all sorts of trouble because he just refused to rise up over his human weakness. And so because of this intertwining of this divine purpose of God and the wickedness of the individual whom is the deliverer of Israel, it's hard for us to decipher what we should do with Samson. Right? That should sound familiar by now if you've been with me through Judges. What do we do with these guys? What do we do with all these judges? And I hope that by now you already know the answer. What we do with Samson is not the point of the story. What we do with this guy isn't the point of the narrative. The point of the story, the point of Samson's life, is the same as the recording of the lives of all of the other judges. It's so that we can see beyond them to God's purpose. It's so that we can see what God is doing in and through them, behind them, often in spite of them, to get us where? To David. To get us to the fact that Israel needs to recognize you got to have a king. And that king has to be God's anointed. That's where it's all headed. And so what we're going to see in this chapter, in these two chapters, is very clearly what God is doing among his sinful people by using a sinful person in order to save them from their enemies and ultimately speaking, hopefully, from their sin. So we're just going to walk through the passage as we always do. And the way our author has set this passage up, it's actually really brilliant. If we were doing sort of an Old Testament hermeneutic class, I would use these two chapters because our author has structured things brilliantly to help you follow the narratives. There's going downs and going ups, and it's downs and ups and downs and ups. There's secrets that's being told, right? The author structured, here's a secret, and then it's unfolded. And then here's another secret, and then it's unfolded. And then you got the Philistines who have a problem, they offer a solution, and then Samson does something, whatever, with his temper, a little stupid, a little off the hook, and he destroys their solution. So then the Philistines come up with another solution, and then Samson comes in and bursts that one up. Brilliant, brilliant writing. But the key here, I'll just point you to it, is verse 4. We're going to get to verse 4, not quite yet, but verse 4 is actually the conclusion or how you should see Samson's life, and then the author is going to show us all of Samson's life. So you got to hold verse 4 in your mind, and we've seen the author of Judges do this before. We'll say, here's what God is doing. Now let me show you this absolutely moronic, wicked, idiotic judge doing all these things that that don't fit with what you think should happen, and then let's see how God works it all out kind of in the end. So we'll get to verse 4, but just to anticipate that, our author is going to give us this introduction/conclusion, and he's going to fall everything out of that. So here's where we find ourselves, right? Samson has grown up. He's already an adult, and God was beginning to stir him to fulfill his role as the deliverer of Israel. And at the beginning of chapter 14, we're told that Samson goes down to Timnah. Again, sort of a border town, northern border of where the Philistines were living, close to the kind of the edge of Dan, the edge of Judah, that kind of thing. And again, we don't have any details as to why Samson wanted to travel to Timnah. We don't know whether this was the first time, the 10th time, the 15th time. We have no idea if he'd been there before. But what we do know, as is typical of Samson's life, is there is a woman involved. And when Samson went to Timnah, there was a woman there, and in his mind, it was, I don't think, again, knowing a bit of what we do about Samson, I don't know that it was necessarily love at first sight, probably more like lust at first sight or something like that. But he sees this woman in one of his trips down to Timnah, and he wants her. And the narrative is very clear that Samson did not have a relationship with this woman. Like, it's not like they met each other on, like, I don't know, what would be an app that they would use or stones that they would send to each other. They weren't writing love letters. They didn't meet each other and go to the local Starbucks and have coffee, and then he decides, I want her. The impression you get is that he was in Timnah and he saw her and he was like, I want that. It's very carnal, it's very lustful, it's very selfish in what Samson is doing here. He sees this woman and he says, I want her. So he goes back home, and Samson instructs his parents, go and get this woman for my wife. That's the one I want. And the impression you get again from this is that this is no conversation, this is no interaction between the parents and the son. This is a demand. Dad, go and get that woman for me. I saw her, I want her, that's my future wife. You go and make it happen. And again, given what we know about Samson's character, given what we know about his sinful lusts, it sure seems that by the time we get to verse 3, we've got a situation that is entirely selfish. And let's not miss the verbiage. Notice what it says. Get her for me. Why? For she is right in my eyes. Now, this is the first. Now, you haven't read the rest of Judges yet. You haven't read it. But what you will read is that Israel will be described in this exact same way. What is the problem with Israel? They do what is right in their own eyes. And right now you're having this judge who is doing what is right in his. He is simply a product of his own Israelite situation. He is Israel in a lot of ways. He is doing what is right in his own eyes. He's disregarding the law of God. He's disregarding the practice of Israel, and he is just following his own lustful desires that he has seen with his eyes. Now, obviously, Samson's parents are very concerned at the beginning of verse 4. They obviously would have had concerns. Not only was Samson an Israelite, and Israel was not allowed to marry with the other Canaanite nations, right? Go back all the way to the beginning of Judges. That's one of the first things identified as the issue. Why does Israel worship the Baals and the Asherah? Why? Because they've intermarried with the Canaanites. Intermarriage leads to a defiance of Israelite religion and an embracing of Canaanite religion. And so here, we've got the same issue. The parents are like, dude, you're an Israelite. You don't marry Canaanites. But it's more than that, right? Because not only is he an Israelite, but he's also taken a Nazirite vow. There's something special about this man, something unique about his calling. And so they question, how could you possibly fulfill your calling? How could you be faithful to your vow if you're married to a pagan woman? Notice they say an uncircumcised Philistine is what she is called. That's back in verse 3. In other words, if Philistine was not an insult enough, uncircumcised is even more so. Like, you do realize you're dealing with an absolute pagan, contradictory to God's law, and you should have nothing to do with these people. Surely, there's got to be someone from your tribe, from the nation of Israel that you will find acceptable as a wife. Why do you have to go across the border? Why do you have to go to Timnah into Philistia to find a wife? But Samson will have absolutely none of this. He's declared his intent. He's given his parents their directives, and so he orders his father, again, go and get her for me. Go and get her for me. And the reason why he is so insistent is because what we understand him to be is this product of his own time, right? He is the guy who's going to do what is right in his own eyes. And so Samson, in this way, demonstrates two very dangerous characteristics which are evident within his own life, but they're also evident within the nation of Israel. First of all, and there's lots of things we could say, but I think as a mirror of where Israel is, I think we see a couple of specific things we have to be very, very aware of. First of all, we recognize him, which is also true of the nation, as incredibly sinfully impulsive. One of the things that will characterize Samson's life is how impulsive he is, how sensual he is, how in tune with his own sinful senses and the satisfaction of those senses that he actually is. What he sees, he wants. What he wants, he takes. His lusts, his desires, the immediacy of things is what control him. Right? Remember, one of the things we talked about earlier on with Israel is, why do the Baals and the Asherah appeal to them? Because they are fertility. They deal with, you sacrifice to the gods and your cows will have more calves, better calves. Your fields will grow. Your olive gardens will grow. Your grapes will better harvest. It's a more immediate, sensual type of thing. If I do this to this God, he will give me produce. He will give me children. He will bless me with cattle. And here we see a microcosm of that in Samson. He sees what he wants to fulfill his immediate desire, and he's like, I want that. Go and get me that. He sees it, he likes it, he wants it, he goes, and then he takes it. And what we're seeing here in the life of Samson, what we will see even more in chapter 16, is just the depths of sinfulness and the depths of wickedness that come when you follow immediacy. When you follow physical, sensual temptations to their natural conclusion. So incredibly sinfully impulsive. Second, he is incredibly stubborn and unteachable. Right? He's completely dismissive of his parents' counsel and authority. Now, at this point, we have to be careful because we could go off on a tangent about, like, kids, obey your parents. But that's not the point, I don't think. Kids, obey your parents. Okay? That's not the point. The point is that somebody who is older, wiser, embedded within Israelite life, who understands what an Israelite should do, how they should behave, comes to Samson and says, here's the deal, here's where you're making the errors, here's what you should be doing instead. This is a course of action that you should be following. You should be rejecting all of that. And Samson's like, I don't care. I don't care. I do not care. And what makes it worse is that it's his father doing it. Right? So that's a layer added on. His father is just reminding him about what the law has to say. And the fact that he rejects his father shows exactly how stubborn and unteachable, how sinfully impulsive this man actually is. And again, we've seen that within the life of Israel throughout the entire book of Judges. They want immediacy in their religion. They want something that they can react. I do this sacrifice, I get this benefit. The law of God is right there. The law of God speaks to them all the time, and they are refusing to return. Refusing. But Samson's impetuous personality and his willful wickedness does not stand in the way of God's designs. Verse 4 is very clear on that. And as I mentioned, it's the key to understanding Samson's life. It's the key to understanding what God is doing in general in the book of Judges. And it's reflective of several statements we've seen made in the book of Judges thus far. So here's the narrator, the writer, giving us as readers information that the people in the story don't have. So we can read the rest of the story with this in mind. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord. Did not know that Samson going down to Timnah, finding that lady, being the jerk that he was, asking for this woman, that was actually something that God had allowed to happen. Why? For God was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. Remember back in 13? That's why Samson was given to this unnamed woman, to Manoah. Right? He is going to save and deliver from the Philistines. And now that Samson is older and marrying age, now God enacts his plan. He allows Samson to go into Timnah. He allows this woman to be there. He uses the sinfulness and the wickedness of Samson to bring about this opportunity to defeat the Philistines, because at the time the Philistines ruled over Israel. Now this gives us two key things to keep in mind as we move forward into the passage. One is sort of smaller. The other one is sort of the major key. So the first thing we have to understand about where things are at and the warning that it is for us comes at the end of verse 4. Why did God need an opportunity to move against the Philistines? Why were the Philistines a problem? Why did God need to judge them? Why did he need to send to deliver? Well, because of the end of verse 4. The Philistines ruled over Israel. And remember, 40 years. And remember, they didn't cry out. They seemed to be quite comfortable with it. And so what we're left with thinking is that at this point, there probably would have been very little that would have distinguished Israelites from Philistines. Probably very little between the two of them that would have actually brought out a distinction. And in fact, when we get later on in the story in chapter 15, verses 11 to 13, the Israelite army that will come against Samson while he's in the cave are more than willing to cough up Samson if it just means peace and prosperity and we'll sacrifice one of our own to just have everything be status quo. And so this is a huge issue because they're not just being oppressed. It seems that they have become comfortable in harmonious coexistence. they're fine living under the oppression of the Philistines with them around them. But we know that God has commanded that to not be the case. They were commanded to separate themselves from the Canaanites, to drive them out of the promised land, to protect the borders so no one could ever come back in. And it's a lesson for us as well. You see, when there's no conflict between us as Christians, us as the church, and the world, we've already lost. We cannot live in a harmonious coexistence with the world. The world is darkness. We are to be light. The world is against what God is doing in the church, and we should be seeing that. There should be conflict between our worldview and the worldview of those out there. It just should be the way that it is. And if there isn't, we've got a problem. You've got a problem that needs to be explored. So that's the minor theme that's going on here. That's what God is trying to root out of Israel. Here's the major theme that verse 4 brings to us that we have to hold in our minds as we move throughout this passage. And we'll state it here, and then we'll conclude with it when we're done with chapter 15. The reality of where Israel is not a hindrance to God. It's an occasion for his activity. Excuse me. And what we recognize in this story is that God can use anyone for his purposes, even someone like Samson. You see, Samson's sin in this story, his personality, the anger that he possesses, the lusts that he demonstrates, are neither going to hinder God's purposes nor thwart his plan. God was looking for an opportunity against the Philistines. And Samson would, in the words of the angel of the Lord delivered to his mother, deliver Israel from the Philistines. Why? Because that's what God had put him on the planet to do. God's purposes for Samson's life was to use him as an instrument to free Israel from the Philistines. God's purposes are vastly greater than anything we could possibly imagine. What Samson's parents could not see at the moment, how could they, right? Let's not criticize them. Let's not say they were unaware, they were absentee parents, Let's not say that, right? It's very, very clear. His father and mother didn't know because they couldn't know, right? What they didn't know is that God was using Samson as an unwilling instrument, and thus, even as unwilling, God would accomplish everything that he purposed. Samson would do what Samson wanted to do, and in and through it all, God was accomplishing his greater purpose. Why? Because that's what God put Samson on the earth to do. So the amazing truth about God is that he works through sinners. He works within sinful situations. Isn't it encouraging that sin is no hindrance to God's designs? He keeps his promises. He fulfills his plans, even in the dark and disastrous periods of our lives that are brought about by the sinfulness and wickedness, even of ourselves or of others around us. Not even our own sin can keep God from bringing about his purposes. And as we've said before many times, what are his purposes? To save us, to sanctify us, to glorify us, to use us. Mysteriously, often unseen, usually far beyond our comprehension, God works through the free and often flawed choices that people make. In all things, Paul says, God works for the good of those who love him. In all things, all of them. And the supreme example of this is found when Peter preaches in Acts chapter 2. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God, with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst. As you yourselves know, this Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. If God could use that to bring about the salvation of the earth and all those who believe, think about what God can do through a guy like Samson. Think about what God can do through someone like you. Praise God for his sovereignty and for his commitment to his divine plan. So verse 4, hold that in your mind. This is what God is doing. So verses 5 to 9, we get one of the many more familiar stories of Samson. He encounters a lion. So now we've got another trip. Samson going back to Timnah. For whatever reason, his parents are lagging behind. Samson runs ahead. And as he's approaching the vineyards of Timnah, a young lion rushes towards him. And he's determined to tear Samson limb from limb. And in that moment, we're told very clearly that the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon Samson. And it empowers him to tear this beast limb from limb, like a young goat. Now, again, the impression you're supposed to get is not that someone goes into their among their cattle and just grabs a goat and starts ripping it apart. The impression you're supposed to get is once you put a young goat on a spit, right? You put it out there and it's nice and juicy and you're getting ready, like that just comes right off the bone. Like that's the impression you're supposed to get. Like this was like he was eating a young goat just freshly cooked, just pulling the legs off of this lion and just tossing it aside. Now, this is not the first time that we read that the Spirit of God has come on judges. We read about it with Othniel in chapter 3, Gideon in chapter 6, Jephthah in chapter 11, and now we read about it in Samson. And this sort of changes things a little bit. I have to admit, as I was kind of rereading this story kind of over the summer and thinking about stuff like that, I realize how much Sunday school I've got in my head, right? So, for example, how is Samson pictured in all of the children's coloring books? Like, dude is just like friggin' jacked, right? Like, he's got traps, he's body, like he can pose up and win Mr. Universe. But you know what the text is clear about? Whenever Samson accomplishes a feat of strength, it's because of what? The Spirit of God. Samson might have been a 6'3", $150 ginger. Sorry, I apologize to any gingers out there. Spencer, I apologize. Right? Dude could have been a 6'3", $150 soaking wet guy. But when the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, boom. He could have been I better be careful. 5'5", 250 dude. But the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and that lion cannot do anything to him. Not because he's been training to fight lions. It's not like he's an MMA fighter here. It's the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. Why does the Spirit of the Lord rush upon him? Well, what does verse 4 say? Because God is at work to destroy the Philistines. And this is part of the plan. This is part of the opportunity. So Samson is empowered throughout the stories because God is working his purposes. And he sends the Spirit of the Lord as a situational gift to Samson to be able to accomplish this purpose. And then what does he do? He goes on to Timnah. He doesn't tell anybody. And once there, he talks to this woman. And he liked her, right? Why? Again, we read because she was right in Samson's eyes. Now, the narrative fast forwards to the next time he visits this woman. Probably months later, okay? I'm no biologist, but I'm assuming that it would take several months for a lion's carcass for a dead lion to turn into a carcass lion. And it would probably take a few weeks or months in addition to that for bees to find the thing and for them to create a hive and honey and all the rest, right? So we're not talking about an immediate thing in the story. But when Samson comes back, you get the impression, using our sanctified imagination, he was like, oh yeah, I killed a lion here. Let's go and see that thing. And he goes there and he sees that there's honey in the carcass. And he's like, okay, that's delicious. So he scoops out some of the honey and he eats it and he gives some to his parents. Now, at this point, we have to be careful. I don't want to get too much into this, but often here again, we're told that in doing this, Samson has violated his Nazirite vows. He doesn't. He hasn't. He does violate the law of God, okay? So, and in doing so, in giving the honey to his parents, he's also engaged them in violating the law of God. So the impression you're supposed to get here is that Samson has no regard for the Old Testament law. I mean, we should understand that already. He's going into Philistia and he's going to get a Philistine wife, so he doesn't care about the law of God, and he's touching a carcass of a dead lion, which Leviticus 11 tells us, for whatever reason, you're not allowed to touch a dead carcass of anything with paws. So there you go, right? Now, the Nazirite vow is a little bit different, and we won't get into why. If you're interested in why I think he's not violating his Nazirite vows, we can get into that a little bit later. But he's definitely disregarding the Old Testament law and whatever. And the reason why we're told this story is not as a criticism of Samson. We're told the story so that we can find ourselves laughing at the Philistines in the next part of the story. So we're told the story about the lion so that we can understand the riddle, so that we can then be a participant in what's going on in the story at a level that the Philistines aren't. So this is all preamble to the main story. And so we get to the wedding in verses 10 to 20. And Manoah initiates the meeting of Samson's selected woman, and we meet. He met formally with the bride, perhaps accompanied by her parents. An agreement is reached in verse 10 about what they're going to do. And now it seems that the couple is engaged. The fathers, this ancient Near Eastern custom, whatever you want to think, the parents have agreed Samson should marry this girl, so the engagement is now on. And it's followed by the customary, I don't know what you want to call it. It's not really a wedding thing. It's sort of maybe a bachelor party. It's more a Philistine Canaanite thing that's going on here than an Israelite thing. What's happening here is there's a 7-day feast to celebrate the wedding of these two individuals. And since Samson was by himself with his parents, he doesn't have anybody to stand up for him. He doesn't have a guy to throw the bachelor party. He doesn't have any groomsmen to hang out with. And so you get the impression, I think the wording here, again, no Hebrew scholar, but it seems that the wording that the author is using is that these guys, they're described as companions, but they're actually forced into this. That they're kind of chosen by the father of the bride. It's like, you are going to be his groomsmen. And you get the impression they don't want that, which is why I think they're so willing to engage in this riddle, right? They're willing to sort of screw each other over here as groomsmen. This isn't a friendly little banter that goes on here. And so they have this big feast, this big 7-day wedding party in which they are doing all their stuff. And during the feast, Samson enters into the contest. No idea why he wanted to do this, no idea why he thought this riddle would be a good idea. He just figures, listen, I may be able to get something out of this. 30 changes of clothes would be awesome. So he says, here's your riddle. If you solve this riddle, I will give each of you 30 changes of clothes, straight from your oinyebexa all the way to your outer garments. If you lose, you return the favor to me. Okay? They're like, yeah, let's do this. Here's the riddle. Out of the one who eats came something sweet. Out of the strong one came something sweet. And so they hear the riddle. You get the impression that there's some time issues here. The Septuagint has 4 days, and the Hebrew the original Hebrew has 7 days, and so you don't really know the timeline here. But the author doesn't seem to necessarily care. What he cares about is that the Philistine groomsmen go away for 3 days. They have no clue. They have no idea. The clock is ticking. The festival is 7 days long. They have to come to an answer by day 7. They're halfway through. They have no idea. And so they see the end coming. They don't want to cough up 30 sets of clothes. And so they decide to get devious. They decide to get manipulative in their answer. And so they go to Samson's wife, go to her father, and says, you get an answer or we're going to light you up. We're going to burn you. We're going to kill you and burn you. Now, Samson's bride seems to take them very, very seriously. And so she agrees to their plan, and she manipulates Samson by weeping and whining, suggesting that he doesn't give her an answer because he doesn't love her. Eventually, she wears him down. Now, there might be some marriage lessons in there, but we're going to avoid that for now. Eventually, she wears him down. She gets the answer at the last hour. On day 7, he gives her the answer. She immediately runs off to the groomsmen, and they immediately return to the feast, find Samson, and give him the answer. Obviously, Samson is unimpressed. He is now, on the one hand, lost all of the riches that would surely have been his. And to make it worse, he's now indebted to provide full outfits for all of his 30 groomsmen. And Samson knows that this was done by treachery. You've plowed with my heifer. Remember, when I read that, you guys laughed, right? It's like, you've plowed with my heifer, he said. In other words, you've used her and manipulated her. You've turned her against me. And he is very unimpressed. And now here we're told for the second time that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. And he went down to Ashkelon. Ashkelon is one of the 5 major cities of Philistia. This one being the most northern one, and it's on the coast. So he goes from Timnah and he goes kind of that way over to the coast. He finds 30 Philistine men. He kills them all, returns and presents these outfits to each of the groomsmen. Now again, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him to do this. Why? Because God is looking for an opportunity to judge the Philistines, to separate Israel from the Philistines. And then, once it's all done, Samson is mad and he stomps off home. And that is the literal reading of the text. He was angry and he stomped off home. You can just imagine muttering to himself and kicking stones and getting angry and angry and angry as he goes home. The father of the bride is like, well, I'm on the hook for all this party. I've spent all the money on this wedding. We're having a wedding. So he picks the best man and he gives the bride to the best man. Samson, knowing nothing about this. Not yet, anyway. So then we get to chapter 15. Some time passes. The impression you get is we're not dealing with days. We're probably dealing with several weeks, maybe a couple of months. And eventually Samson has cooled off, settled down, and he returns home, or to the home of his wife, and he brings a gift. He brings a young goat. And it's an apology. It's sort of his equivalent of bringing flowers or whatever. Not sure you'd want a young goat, but this is what he brings. And he's ready to consummate the marriage, to make it official, and then to move on. And again, put yourself with a little bit of sanctified imagination in this, right? You're the bride's father. You see Samson coming down the road holding well, let's pretend he's this skinny dude. He's dragging this unwilling goat along. And you're the father, and you're like, oh no. What are we going to do? Because you knew that he killed 30 Philistines because he lost a riddle bet. What's this dude going to do when he finds out I've given the daughter to another guy? So he does something super creepy. He's like, you know what? You are going to marry the ugly one. I'll give you the hot one. That's what he says. He says, yeah, you know what? You saw her. Have you seen her? Right? She's not very attractive and she's old. She is hot and young. Do you want her? Well, Samson is in absolutely no mood for an upgrade. He absolutely has no desires to have this upgrade. He's angry, and he uses this slight by the father of his bride as the occasion to make all of the Philistines pay for it. Now, it's a bit difficult to see this connection, but again, verse 4, God has raised up Samson in order to judge the Philistines. You'd think that Samson's beef would simply be with dad, but he sees this as a slight against him by the Philistines, by the people, his groomsmen, etc., etc., etc. So Samson is going to pour out his wrath upon all of the local farmers. Somehow, we don't know how, he manages to catch 300 foxes. He attaches them in pairs by binding their tails together, and then he attaches a burning torch to each pair. Now, we know, or you should know, that you tie anything together, and they're not going to agree on a direction. You tie two wild animals together like foxes, and they're going to be pulling and jerking, and they're going to be running everywhere. Then you put fire behind them, and we know that animals, like almost all creatures, are scared out of their minds at fire. So they take off into the fields. They're not running in a straight line. They're going everywhere. And there's 150 pairs of these things just ripping through the fields. And here's the major issue for the Philistines, is that it's during the time of the wheat harvest. So the wheat was cut, all the stalks were down, and some of them are brought together into bushels, and they're standing there, but some of them are also laid down, and there's a whole bunch of dry stubble all over these fields. I mean, it's a tinderbox, just waiting to be burned up. And so these foxes take off, scared out of their minds, with these torches attached to them, and they're setting fire to literally everything they come into contact with. Not just the fields of grain, but also the vineyards and the olive groves. Everything is being burned up because Samson was denied his wife. And so he deals a devastating blow. This had to have been a devastating blow to the Philistines, and not the least of which we could say the Philistine economy, right? To the Philistine, this would have created famine. How are they going to trade? What are they going to eat? Right? The whole thing is just gone. And the Philistines were enraged, and they promptly learned the identity of the culprits. It was Samson, and by proxy, or the occasion for Samson's anger, is his wife and her father. And they learn that Samson was taking vengeance on the Philistines because his wife was given by her father to the best man. And so verse 6 tells us that they did what they threatened to do earlier, just a different occasion. They burned the woman and they burned her father, killed them. Now again, this is their solution to the Samson problem. But it solved nothing. Generally speaking, not a good idea to burn a man's wife. Samson is very angry, and he escalates things. He feels justified now to attack and slaughter a large number of the Philistines. Verse 8. We're not told, kind of what he did or how many he killed or anything like that. We're just simply told this very unique statement that he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow. That phrase doesn't occur anywhere else in the Old Testament. No idea what we mean, but the idea here is that he's livid, he's laying waste. And then he runs off to a cliff, hides himself in a cave of Etam. Now, once again, we're going back and forth here, right? The Philistines, now they're mad again, right? Samson's mad, Philistines are mad. Samson's mad again. Now the Philistines are mad. So what do? They amass an army and they travel to Lehi, which is in Israel where Samson was hiding. So they cross the border. Now they're in Israel. Now keep in mind, the Philistines were oppressing Israel. So this would be considered an act of aggression. This is an act of war. And now, verses 9 and 10, we find out that when they travel there to find him, the men of Judah find themselves caught in the middle. Between the Philistine oppressors, their masters, if you want to say it that way, and this really troublemaking Samson guy. And so they weigh it out, and they say, we've got an army of Philistines coming. They're prepared for battle. Let's assume they're ready to lay waste to everything until they find Samson. And on the other side, we got one guy. And they're willing to sacrifice the one for the many, even if he's an Israelite. So to avoid any hostilities, they employ diplomatic means. They say, hey, we'll find him, we'll bind him, we'll bring him to you. Is that good? Like, will you then leave our lands and go back? You can do whatever you want to Samson. Just don't make us pay for his sin the way Philistia paid for the fathers of the bride's wrongdoing, right? So the men of Judah, they agree, right? Yes, let's do that. Now, they must have heard about Samson and his skills, a particular set of skills, if you want to say it that way. Sorry, I had to include that. So they gather 3,000 men. 3,000 men to capture a guy who's already in a choke point. He's already in a cave. You don't need 3,000 men to capture Samson. Bit of overkill, but Samson had a reputation, so they go and get him. And they rebuke him. They tell him, you're putting Judah at risk. And they do not look at Samson's actions against the Philistines with any kind of favor. Again, they don't know that God is trying to destroy the Philistines through Samson. They're comfortable with their relationship with the Philistines. They don't want anything disturbed. They don't want the relative peace that they have with their Canaanite occupiers to be altered in any way, shape, or form. So they're angry at them. They're so driven by peace with the Philistines that they have no idea that this guy might actually be on their side, might actually be fighting for them. And so the statement of the men of Judah in verse 11 is actually reflective of the spiritual state of Israel at the time. Right? Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? In other words, do you not know that we're totally happy being oppressed by the Philistines and you're ruining the whole situation? So Samson and the men of Judah come to an agreement in verses 12-13. The men promised not to kill Samson if he would surrender, if he would allow himself to be bound. They would deliver Samson to the Philistines so they could kill him. So Samson is bound and led from his place of hiding, and he's handed over, or he's going to be handed over to the Philistines not far away. So the Philistines are over there, the Israelites are over there, and leading the group as the men of Judah approach the Philistine army is Samson. He's bound, he's in custody, and you get the sense here that the Philistines feel like this is their moment of success. They're finally going to find revenge. And they let out a great shout. And the idea is they're not just randomly screaming. This is what you do at the end of a battle. When the battle is over and you have won, you let out a great shout. Not just a celebration, but to let everybody know in your army that you have indeed won and they can now just stop swinging, right? So that's the idea here. They let out this triumphant thing. They're going to punish their oppressor once and for all. We're in verse 14 and 15 now. And now, what happens again? Third time in this in this text. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson, and he breaks free of the ropes. They fall away. They just disintegrate as Samson separates his hands. And now that he's free, he seizes a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and with this highly unlikely weapon in hand, Samson takes on this Philistine detachment that had been sent to arrest him. And we're told in verse 15 that 1,000 Philistines were killed with this unusual weapon. Now, earlier we read of a judge who killed a bunch of Canaanites with an ox goad, right? What you would use to an ox with a round thumpy end and a pointy end at the other side. And you sort of go, okay, well, I can sort of see how that could be a weapon, but a jawbone. And I have to admit, I did Google what a donkey jawbone looked like. And it's not the best of weapons. But guess what? Doesn't matter. The Spirit of the Lord descended upon him. Why? Because God was looking for a way to separate Israel from the Philistines. And so he could have picked up a jawbone, he could have picked up anything he wanted, and God was going to give him victory on that day. Following this victory, don't know how long it took, don't know what he did, don't know where he had to go. But in response to this victory, Samson composed a brief song, only 2 lines, to memorialize the occasion. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. Now, there's a play on words here that I'm wondering if I can say, because there's homonyms here in the Hebrew between donkey and heaps. And so, with the jawbone of a donkey, basically what he's not talking about creating heaps upon, he's saying, I've turned them into donkeys. Right? With the jawbone of a donkey, I have turned them into donkeys upon donkeys. I've turned them into the jawbone. That's what he's saying. With the jawbone, I've turned them into jawbones. Right? With the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. So he's saying, hey, I was awesome in this fight. Right? And so you get the impression throughout this text that Samson doesn't know that God has empowered him. That it's not that God announced to him and said, oh, I'm sending the Spirit of God, there's a jawbone, off you go. Like he's not given super serum or anything like that, and he knows this, right? He destroyed all these guys. And again, this is why I like to think of him, 6'3", $150, this little, he's an accountant by trade, right? And then he looks at himself and goes, 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone? I'm awesome, right? How did I do this? I have no idea, but I did. But we know as the narrator has told us that this is God doing it. And as soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called essentially Jawbone Hill. Jawbone Hill, verse 17. And then in verse 18, that's when Samson sort of settles down and realizes that actually it's probably God was involved at some point here. He acknowledges the Lord's agency in the defeat of the Philistines, and he reckons, Samson does, that if God can achieve this great salvation, again, you have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. If God can give him this level of victory, surely God can provide water. I mean, again, I'm assuming killing 1,000 Philistines would create a little bit of a thirst. And God obliges, creates a spring, and he gives Samson water from that. And the author tells us that it remains there even until this time, so that anybody who comes by this particular well is going to remember what Samson had done. And then the chapter ends in a very interesting spot, because verse 4 suggests to us that since God was looking for a way to destroy the Philistines, you would expect that now, after killing 1,000 Philistines and burning a whole bunch of their stuff, that this is the hour for victory. But that's not what we read. Notice what we read in verse 20. Samson judged Israel in the days of the Philistines, 20 years. Now that's foundationally different from any other statement we've read that summarized any other judge's rule. We've always read, and Israel enjoyed peace for 20 years, and then Samson died, and then things go all messed up again. But that's not what we read. These things are not the same. He judged Israel where? When? What's characteristic of him? In the days of the Philistines. In other words, we are right back to where we were at the beginning of chapter 13. Yes, he's burned a bunch of fields. Yes, he's killed 30 people from the coastal city. Yes, he's laid waste to 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone, but he has not yet freed Israel from their Philistine problem. He has not yet fulfilled his role as deliverer. God has not yet freed Israel. We wait for that potentially in the next chapter. So, what do we do with Samson? Here we are right at the end. And if we're honest, I think we could say in broad strokes, so far so good for Samson, I think. Right? The judges were raised up by God, were enabled by the Spirit, delivered God's people from the oppression that resulted from the corruption that came because of their wickedness. And Samson had done exactly that. He'd done exactly what we've seen all the other judges in the past. In fact, he is unique in this way. 3 times has he been empowered by the Spirit of God to fulfill his role as a deliverer of Israel. 3 times has he been empowered so that God can win a victory over the enemies of Israel. In fact, if this is all that we knew about Samson, it would actually make the words of Hebrews 11:32 to 34 actually more palatable. And what more should I say, the author of Hebrews asks? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. That almost sounds like these 2 chapters, doesn't it? That almost sounds like we're reading straight off a summary of Samson's narrative thus far. Now, is Samson perfect in this narrative? Do we take from these chapters that Samson's a good example for us to follow? No, absolutely not. His actions are brutal by our standards, yes, but let's not judge the ancient Near Eastern culture by our standards. Is he an example for us to follow? Absolutely not. For all the good things that God accomplishes in Samson, there's a whole bunch of stuff about Samson that is truly horrific. He's just short list that I came up with. You can add a few things if you like. He's disrespectful of his parents. He's completely callous, not only to his Israelite heritage, but he's callous to the law of Israel, and he's callous to the consequences of his actions for his people. He compromises his ethics. He's rude to his wife. He's flippant with his tongue. He's greedy. He's ruthless. He's self-centered. He's easily angered. And he shows throughout that his physical passions are going to be his guide above all else. And yet we return to where we started. God continues to work. The tools available to God are always crude and imperfect. Why? Because they're always human. They're always human. The tools available for God to accomplish His purposes are always finite and fallen human beings like Samson, like you, like me. But God will always accomplish his purpose. He will always deliver his people. We have witnessed this time and time again in the book of Judges. God operates in unusual ways. And his purposes and his plans are never thwarted by sin or evil. Even when sin and evil pops up within the very judge that God had raised to deliver Israel. God's agenda for his people will never fail, even though his people are often committed to spiritual suicide. And what an encouragement this should be for us. God has promised to never leave us or forsake us. He has promised that no one will ever snatch us from his hand. He has promised that all things will work together for the good of those who love him in Christ Jesus. He has promised that our full salvation, past, present, and future, are guaranteed for us in the work of Jesus Christ. Is it not then encouraging for us, empowering for us to know and see displayed for us throughout the book of Judges that many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand? And is it not encouraging for us to read, as was read for us this morning from Psalm 33, the Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the people. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we praise you for your sovereignty. Even though we can't see it, even though we do not understand it, we praise you that your plans are never thwarted by anything that we can do, by any machinations of the world around us, whether it be economics or politics or militaries or worldviews or whatever it is. Your plans will always happen the way you have designed for them to happen from eternity past. And Lord, may we rest in faith in those promises. Lord, may we not seek answers. May we not seek to uncover those plans, which are part of your secret things, which you have said you'll never reveal to us. But Lord, may we seek you, your character, your nature, so that we can be comforted more and more and more as we rest in who you are and rest in what you have done for us in Jesus Christ. And Lord, as we find that rest, as we find that comfort, Lord, may we not keep that to ourselves, but may we use that to encourage those around us who are downtrodden. May we use it as an impetus to go out into the world with the gospel, to share with those who are dying from the wages of their sin. And Lord, as we do so, take our obedience such that it is given to you by finite and fallen creatures and use it for your glory and the furtherance of your kingdom. Amen.